Miss Morley and the Woman Who Saw Her Own Death. Chapter 1. The Prediction. The train to Melord slowed as it approached the quaint countryside station, its whistle slicing through the serene afternoon air. Miss Morley, seated comfortably by the window, observed as fields transformed into thatched cottages and meandering lanes. There was a distinct stillness enveloping the village, an aura of something unsaid. She had arrived at the invitation of Mrs. Edith Weatherby, an old friend from her youth. Their correspondence had been sporadic over the years, yet Edith had recently reached out to her, emphasizing that her visit was long overdue. As Miss Marple stepped onto the platform, Edith welcomed her with warmth, though there was a hint of restraint, as if a burden lingered in her thoughts. They navigated the narrow streets, the village strangely quiet, as if it were pausing in anticipation. Inside Edith's charming yet somewhat cluttered home, tea was served promptly, the aroma of freshly baked scones wafting through the air, yet an undeniable tension hung in the atmosphere. Edith's hands quivered slightly as she poured the tea. "Tea, you've arrived at quite the moment, Jane," she remarked, her voice tinged with an unspoken weight. Miss Marple merely nodded, aware that there was more to unfold, and that eventually it would. As Edith stirred her tea with a measured slowness, she finally broke the silence. "Do you recall Estelle Carrington? She wed Richard, the banker's son, a lovely girl, always somewhat fragile. Recently, however, the entire village has been buzzing about her." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Buzzing about her?" Edith leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. There's something quite strange about what Jane has been saying. She insists she has foreseen her own death." The words hung in the air, absurd yet unsettlingly resolute. "Foreseen," Miss Marple echoed, as if trying to grasp the weight of it. "Jane has told anyone who would listen that she has seen it her own death happening in exactly 3 days." Miss Marple took a measured sip of her tea, observing her friend over the rim of the cup. The certainty in Edith's voice and the subtle tension in her hands suggested this was not mere village gossip. "People are saying she's unwell," Edith continued, "or that she's always." There was a fanciful quality to her, yet an undeniable conviction lingered in the air. Miss Marple set her cup down, contemplating a woman who foresaw her own demise. Either a tragedy loomed, or something far more intriguing was at play. By the time Miss Marple encountered Estelle Carrington, the evening air had acquired a crispness that seemed to carry whispers through the narrow village streets. Edith had orchestrated their meeting at the Carrington residence, a stately yet somber house perched on the village's edge, its ivy-covered walls cloaked in the fading light of dusk. Estelle was not what Miss Marple had anticipated. There was no hysteria, no frantic proclamations. Instead, the woman before her was poised yet weary, her eyes shadowed by something deeper than mere fatigue. "I have seen my own death, Miss Marple," she stated, her voice steady, though an undercurrent of fragility lingered beneath it. "It will happen in 3 days." Miss Marple studied her carefully. The words were delivered not as a plea nor a confession, but as a certainty. "You sound quite sure of it." Estelle offered a small, almost apologetic smile. "Smile, that's the trouble, isn't it? I wish I weren't." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, observing her with quiet attentiveness. "How did you come to this certainty?" Estelle hesitated for only a moment before answering. "It wasn't a dream, it wasn't a feeling. I saw it, Miss Marple, as though it had already happened. And the worst part, her hands tightened slightly over the arms of her chair. I know I won't be able to stop it." A pause, then a quiet exhalation of breath, heavy with something Miss Marple recognized well, genuine fear. Morning arrived, and Estelle Carrington's foreboding prediction circulated through the village like ripples in a pond. At the local grocer's by the churchyard gate, hushed conversations over freshly brewed tea filled the air. Everywhere, there was talk of the woman who claimed to have witnessed her own demise. Some dismissed it with a knowing smile, labeling it hysteria or an overactive imagination, the kind of thing one might expect from a woman with too much time and too many novels. Others, more skeptical, whispered of omens and fate, feeling uneasy yet unwilling to confront the unsettling notion. To express it openly, her husband Richard Carrington was undeniably pragmatic, perhaps excessively so. A man of finance, he was measured and distant, lacking patience for what he referred to as Estelle's nonsense. He was overheard remarking that this would pass, just as all her whims had before. However, those who genuinely understood Estelle, her dear friend Lillian Drake, the housemaid Betty, and even the mild-mannered vicar's wife harbored their doubts. Estelle was not one to indulge in melodrama, nor was she a woman who craved attention. If she had spoken with such certainty of her own death, what then had she seen? Miss Marple listened, filing away each reaction, each dismissal, each casual remark. The village believed it knew Estelle's mind, but Miss Marple had observed something they had not. Estelle was not indulging in fantasy, she was afraid. That afternoon, Miss Marple found herself once again in Estelle's company, seated in the drawing room of the Carrington residence, where the air carried the faintest trace of lavender. Estelle sat with perfect posture, hands resting in her lap, but Miss Marple, she noticed a slight tremor in her fingers, the delicate way she held her teacup as though steadying herself. Her gaze flickered, searching for something or someone who was not there. "You are very certain of it," Miss Marple said at last, her tone carefully neutral as she watched the younger woman closely. Estelle's lips pressed into a thin line. "I am. Yet you don't seem frightened," Miss Marple observed, tilting her head slightly, not in the way one would expect. A small breath of laughter escaped Estelle's lips, humorless and resigned. "That's the peculiar thing, isn't it? I'm not afraid of dying, Miss Marple. I'm afraid of how I know." She set her cup down, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer. "It isn't a dream, it isn't a feeling. It's as though the memory of it already exists." Her hands curled slightly, "And yet I am still here." Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the way Estelle's voice tightened on the last words, as if there were more she wished to say but could not. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "your mind has seen something your conscious self has not yet recognized, a detail, a shadow." A warning Estelle's breath caught for just a moment. Then, as if realizing it, she quickly forced a smile. Miss Marple had seen enough. This was not hysteria. This was a woman who knew something she could not name, and in 3 days, she would be dead. Chapter 2. The Fatal Night. As the evening deepened, Mellord held its breath. The villagers, though rational people, could not help but glance toward Carrington House, their eyes betraying unease. Some spoke of coincidence, of imagination running wild, dismissing Estelle's ominous prediction as hysteria. Lingered in the air as the older folk whispered of matters best left unspoken, invoking superstition under their breath. The pub felt unusually subdued. Even the clinking of glasses was muted, conversations hushed. A group of men stood outside, feigning disinterest while stealing furtive glances toward the Carrington home. Lillian Drake, Estelle's closest friend, had been spotted pacing near the vicarage, wringing her hands. Richard Carrington, her husband, had retired early, or so he claimed. The doctor, Henry Graves, was also in the mix. He had made an uncharacteristically late visit to a patient, his absence duly noted. Miss Marple sat in Edith Weatherby's sitting room, knitting quietly. She had seen such anticipation before, not of curiosity, but of dread. People did not truly believe in premonitions until one threatened to come true. A clock chimed the half hour. The hour drew near. The village, in all its skepticism and doubt, waited. At exactly midnight, her scream tore through the stillness, a single piercing sound, high and jagged, filled with horror. Doors flung open, faces appeared. At windows, a few brave souls ventured out, drawn toward the Carrington residence. The front door had been left ajar, swinging slightly in the night air. It was Lillian Drake who reached her first. She stood frozen at the foot of the grand staircase, her breath shallow, her hands clasped to her mouth as if to contain another scream. Estelle Carrington lay sprawled at the bottom of the staircase, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. Her silk dressing gown, deep blue and precisely as she had described, was eerily pristine. Though untouched by violence, Richard Carrington arrived moments later, his eyes widening in genuine or well-feigned horror. "Dear God," his voice faltered. Behind him, Dr. Graves pushed forward, instinctively kneeling to check for signs of life, but there were none. Someone whispered, she knew. Others muttered prayers, their skepticism crumbling under the weight of what lay before them. Estelle Carrington had predicted her own death, and now she was dead. Miss Marple stepped forward with measured calm, observing what others could not yet see. The house was enveloped in silence, devoid of any signs of a struggle, no gasping final words, just a body lying perfectly still, perfectly positioned. Her keen eyes scanned the details. Estelle's hands revealed one open, palm facing upward, while the other was tightly clenched. Miss Marple observed the edges of fabric peeking through her fingers, a torn scrap of something dark. Dr. Graves straightened, declaring, "She fell," though his voice lacked conviction. "The stairs," he added. "She must have tripped." "Tripped?" Miss Marple echoed softly, yet there was not a single wrinkle. In her gown, the doctor hesitated, eyes darting toward the body. Indeed, her dressing gown lay perfectly smooth, untouched by the violent descent one might expect. Miss Marple's gaze lifted to the staircase, then back to Estelle. She had witnessed many accidents in her time, many misfortunes, but something about this one felt amiss. The air itself was too still, as if everything had been meticulously arranged prior to their arrival. She glanced once more at Estelle's clenched fist. There was a truth held within it, waiting to be uncovered, and Miss Marple, ever patient, Miss Mel's sharp eyes fell upon Estelle's right hand. While one lay open, still and relaxed, the other was tightly clenched, a final, desperate grasp at something unseen. Carefully, she knelt beside the body, her movements unhurried and deliberate. With a gentle touch, she pried open Estelle's fingers, revealing a small scrap of torn fabric, dark against her pale skin. It did not matter her dressing gown. Dr. Graves, still kneeling on the other side, frowned. "Must have been caught on something as she fell," he muttered. Marple offered a slight, courteous nod, yet remained silent. Fabric did not simply tear itself in a fall, nor did the dying grasp at air unless something was there to hold on to behind her. The soft whispers of the assembled villagers intensified. Someone, perhaps Lillian, let out a quiet, involuntary gasp. Miss Marple caught the sound and took note of it. Richard Carrington's voice sliced through the murmurs, declaring, "This is dreadful, dreadful, but it must have been an accident." Estelle was prone to these fits of imagination. She could have tripped in a panic. Miss Marple lifted her gaze to him. His expression was inscrutable. Did he truly believe what he said, or was he merely wishing for others to? Her fingers glided over the frayed, torn edges of the fabric. If Estelle had clung to it in her final moments, then someone close enough to be held had been there with her, someone who preferred to remain hidden. The villagers were already murmuring about fate, about Estelle's uncanny prediction coming to fruition. It all felt too convenient. Miss Marple, however, was skeptical of such notions. If Estelle's demise had been unavoidable, if fate had dictated it, then why was there a torn piece of fabric in her hand? She wondered why she had clutched at something or someone before her fall. This was not fate, it was design. She glanced at the staircase once more. The fall had been silent, too silent. No frantic cry, no sudden thud of missteps. Estelle had not simply slipped. A premonition coming true was one thing, but a premonition being carefully orchestrated to appear fulfilled was something else entirely. Miss Mel was beginning to suspect that Estelle had been meant to die exactly as she had foretold, because someone had ensured it. She folded her hands in her lap, her expression as mild as ever. There was a killer among them, and they had played their role very, very well. Chapter 3. The Suspects. The morning after Estelle Carrington's death, Mellinger's world was divided. Some clung to the eerie truth of her prophecy, muttering about fate, destiny, and things beyond human understanding. They spoke in hushed voices, casting uneasy glances at Carrington House, as if the walls themselves held secrets. Others, more practical and skeptical, dismissed such notions. "There are no illusions here," the butcher's wife remarked, shaking her head as she passed a package of lamb chops. "A fall is a fall, but it wasn't just that, was it?" Miss Marple, ever observant, sensed the unvoiced tension surrounding them. It wasn't merely the fear of the unknown that held the village in its grip. It was something more profound, something sharper. Whispers circulated not only about Estelle's death, but also about one another: Richard Carrington, the grieving husband who appeared to grieve insufficiently, and Lillian Drake, the dear friend who had last seen her. Spoken to Estelle in anger, Dr. Henry Graves, the man who had so easily dismissed Estelle's fears, now found himself questioned. Matthew Lawson, the bookseller who had always watched Estelle from afar, but never too closely, was also present. Miss Marple sipped her tea, observing the village turning in on itself. The question of what had happened was one. The question of who had made it happen was another. And that was the question that truly mattered. Miss Marple had always believed that grief reveals as much as it conceals. Richard Carrington, a man of means and measured restraint, had occupied the morning with matters of business rather than grief, addressing affairs at the solicitor's office. He was overheard speaking in even, calculated tones, inquiring about the execution of Estelle's will, which had been revised recently, though the details remained uncertain. Terrible business, he remarked later when he encountered Miss Marple outside the post office. A dreadful accident, my poor wife. She was always prone to these notions, her fragile mind easily swayed. Miss Marple offered a gentle nod. Observing him closely, his words carried a curious distance, not cold, precisely, but devoid of any authentic sorrow. He was a man who lamented the inconvenience of loss rather than the loss itself. There was no anger, no distress. He simply appeared ready. As he began to depart, she asked, almost absent-mindedly, if she had mentioned her premonition to him. He paused for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. She spoke to everyone about it. He replied with a practiced sigh. I tried to explain that thoughts like that can become self-fulfilling, you know, and with. As he departed, leaving Miss Marple to observe his retreat down the lane, he was acutely aware of the distinction between self-fulfilling and carefully fulfilled. Richard Carrington grasped that nuance with remarkable clarity. Lily and Drake had long been Estelle's dearest companions, yet in the days leading up to her demise, their bond had begun to unravel. She had been the initial one to reach Carrington House on that fateful night, the first to gasp at the sight of Estelle's lifeless form, and the first to vehemently declare that this was no accident. Accident? I sensed something was amiss, she confessed, her voice quivering as she clutched Miss Marple's hand. I should have acted, I should have. Her words faded, and she blinked rapidly, as if pursuing a thought she feared to articulate. Miss Marple, ever patient, waited. Leland inhaled, shaking her head. We argued, you know, just 2 days before she passed. About what? Nothing, Leland replied too hastily, then corrected herself. I mean trivial things. I was concerned for her. She was so utterly convinced about this premonition, and I told her it was nonsense. She grew angry, and said I? Miss Marple observed Lillian's hands twisting in her lap, fingers tightening and loosening as she spoke. And were you? Miss Marple asked gently. Lillian blinked. Was I what? Listening. A pause, a hesitation, then quietly, no. Miss Marple patted her hand. Tell me, dear, when you last saw Estelle, was she afraid of dying? Lillian swallowed hard. She was afraid of something, and that, Miss Marple thought, was not the same thing at all. Dr. Henry Graves was a man of certainty, a physician of many years who prided himself on logic over speculation, science over superstition. It was no surprise that he had dismissed Estelle's premonition outright. She was always prone to nervous fits. He had told the villagers only days before her death, a classic case of self-induced anxiety. Yet now, with her prediction having come true, Dr. Graves seemed less assured. His hands were steady, but Miss Marple noted the small hesitation in his movements, the way he avoided direct questions about the night of Estelle's death. Had he truly been elsewhere when she fell? More curious still was his relationship with Estelle, a doctor and his patient, was certainly complex, but was there more? She trusted him, Leland Drake noted, her voice laced with an indefinable emotion. Perhaps it was too much to consider. She once mentioned confiding in him about things she wouldn't share with Richard, which was significant. A confidant, a man who dismissed her fears. Yet, had he known something after all? Dr. Graves maintained a steady demeanor, his responses unwavering, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes that Miss M did not overlook. Matthew Lawson, on the other hand, was a man of few words, unnoticed by most, save for one peculiar detail: his preoccupation with Estelle Carrington. He was the village bookseller, mild-mannered and reserved, known for his unassuming nature. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and yet he had attended every gathering Estelle hosted, standing just at the edges of conversation, watching. She was remarkable, he said simply when Miss Marple asked about her. His voice was steady, but his fingers twisted the edge of his cuff just slightly. So full of ideas, and yet you never spoke to her much, Miss Marple noted. He hesitated. She overlooked me, an unusual choice of words. We were not familiar, yet she failed to see me a quiet fixation, perhaps. Lillian might have remembered a time when she found Matthew lingering outside Carrington House, his excuse unclear, his presence unnoticed. Yet, on the night of Estelle's death, Matthew had been absent, or so he asserted. Miss Marple scrutinized him a moment longer. He did not appear threatening, but unchecked fixation could manifest in various ways. Having lived long enough, Miss Marple understood that guilt does not always announce itself. Often, it remains silent. Whispers filled the air as she sat at Edith Weatherby's table, stirring a lump of sugar into her tea. Her gaze drifted over the villagers who came and went that morning, those who avoided eye contact, who seemed restless, who laughed a little too loudly. Lily and Drake wrung their hands, their eyes flickering whenever Richard Carrington's name was mentioned. Dr. Graves maintained a measured tone, yet his fingers tapped absently on his desk, revealing an undercurrent of tension. Richard Carrington had appeared so carefully composed, but when Miss Marple brought up Estelle's will, there was a shift. A brief moment of stillness, just enough to register Matthew Lawson's words, polite and mild in tone. Yet, Miss Marple noticed the tension in his shoulders at the mention of Estelle's name. One of them held secrets, and Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, would uncover the truth. Chapter 4. The Clues and Red Herrings. Miss Marple sat in quiet reflection, the scrap of dark fabric lying on the table before her. A seemingly insignificant item, easily dismissed, but Estelle had clutched it tightly in death, her fingers entwined around it in silence. Defiance did not align with her attire as she delicately turned it over, tracing the edges where it had been torn. The frayed thread whispered of struggle, not accident. If Estelle had clutched this fabric in her final moments, it could only signify one thing. Someone had been with her, someone close enough to reach, close enough to tear free. Miss Marple's gaze lifted as Edith Weatherby poured her another cup of tea. So odd, isn't it? Edith murmured. One would expect her to have caught the banister. She gestured to the fabric. Yes, Miss Marple agreed mildly, though her thoughts wandered, the banisters devoid of fabric, unlike the people who surrounded her. Memories of Estelle's death flooded back the villagers, their faces etched with shock, horror, and an undercurrent of guilt. A piece of clothing was absent from the scene, just a scrap, and Miss Marple would uncover its whereabouts. As Edith's words faded into quiet, Miss Marple's mind returned to Estelle's last conversation. The staircase had felt too silent then, an odd comment she had dismissed, but now, with fresh insights, it took on a new significance. Took on an unsettling meaning. She pictured the grand staircase a house of that age should creak. Her home lived in her structure, settled with time, would not allow footsteps to pass unnoticed unless she leaned back slightly, letting the thought unfurl. Had the silence itself been a warning? Had Estelle noticed something too late, a footstep that should have sounded, but did not? Miss Marple's fingers tapped gently against the armrest. It was not the absence of nor noise that mattered, it was the expectation of it. Something had been altered, and Estelle, with the same keen insight that had anticipated her own demise, realized too late to save herself, but perhaps just in time to identify her murderer. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself conversing with Betty, the Carringtons' housemaid, a timid girl, her hands twisting at her apron, eyes flitting about as if dreading reprimand. I don't understand it, ma'am," Betty confessed, lowering her voice. She locked herself in. "I know she did. I heard the bolt slide into place." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, and yet she was found at the foot of the stairs. Betty swallowed. "That's what's wrong, isn't it? No one could have gotten in." Miss Marple studied her carefully. The girl's fear was genuine, but it was not the fear of guilt. It was the fear of something unexplained. Locks could be picked, duplicate keys could be made, but a bolted door was trickier. Unless her thoughts returned to the fabric in Estelle's hand, the silent staircase, the absence of a struggle. "Betty, tell me, when you found her, was the door still bolted?" Betty hesitated. No, it was open." Miss Mel's gaze sharpened. "And did you open it?" The girl paled. "No, ma'am." "Then someone else had, someone who should not have been there at all." Miss Marple had always believed that timing was rarely coincidental. When a person altered their will mere days before their death, It was never a matter of chance. Seated in Mr. Albertson's office, the village solicitor, she listened attentively as he shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing over his spectacles at the document before him. Yes, he admitted at last, Mrs. Carrington did request a revision. It was rather unexpectedly. Miss Marple folded her hands. And what exactly had she changed? Albertson hesitated, then sighed. She had increased a bequest to Lillian Drake, removed a certain investment intended for her husband, and cleared his throat. She named a new beneficiary for a portion of her estate, a personal matter, she said. Miss Marple inclined her head, waiting. Albertson adjusted his glasses. Her sum was designated to Matthew Lawson. That was curious. The quiet bookseller, the man Estelle had barely spoken to, had suddenly become worthy of such consideration. Inheritance unfolded, revealing Richard Carrington, a man facing unexpected losses. The timing felt too precise. Miss Marple expressed her gratitude to Albertson, leaving him to nervously shuffle his papers. She was already aware of the truth. Someone had uncovered the alterations prior to Estelle's passing, indicating that her will was not just a simple revision, but rather a potential motive. That evening, under the vigilant gaze of the housemaid Betty, Miss Marple discovered what she had been seeking: a letter hidden in Estelle's drawer, its edges worn from hasty handling. The handwriting was undeniably Estelle's, yet the message within was deeply unsettling. I realize now it was never a mere premonition. It was a glimpse into something I was never meant to witness. The ink flowed unevenly, as if her hand had paused, fully aware of the gravity of her words. I will set things right. I cannot pretend ignorance any longer. My decision will come tomorrow, and after that, I hope to find safety. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. Estelle had not predicted her own demise. She had comprehended it. She had uncovered something perilous, and, perhaps believing she could reason with the truth, she had left a trail of breadcrumbs for the one person who might piece it all together. A revised will, a silent staircase, a clenched fist gripping fabric. Someone had silenced Estelle before she could act, but Miss Marple had no intention of letting that silence remain unbroken. She folded the letter carefully, her decision made. It was time to set a trap. Chapter 5. The Unraveling of Secrets. Miss Marple had spent a lifetime observing human nature, and she knew that. Guilt seldom manifested in dramatic displays. Instead, it lingered in the subtleties. She sat in the tranquil confines of Edith Weatherby's sitting room, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as the suspects drifted in and out. Their words were meticulously chosen, yet their bodies conveyed a contrasting narrative. Richard Carrington, desperate to project an image of calm, often responded too hastily, as if he had memorized his script in advance. He was a man who had anticipated inquiries long before they were posed, while Lillian Drake exchanged furtive glances. Hands fidgeted, revealing contradictions within minutes. Estelle was anxious that night. She had expressed her worries, yet later appeared almost at peace. Which was it? Dr. Graves, usually confident in his diagnosis, now seemed too rigid, too careful, as if any slip of the tongue might expose too much. Meanwhile, Matthew Lawson, once a silent observer, suddenly had far too much to say. Miss Marple sipped her tea, allowing the conversation to flow around her while offering only a pleasant smile. Each of them was concealing something, and the more they attempted to mask it, the clearer it became. Miss Marple had long held the conviction that murders seldom pertain to the present. Rather, they were the past seeking its reckoning. It was a fleeting comment from an old acquaintance that guided her toward clarity. Poor Estelle, sighed the vicar's wife over tea. She tried so hard to leave it behind her. Miss Mar's knitting needles halted. Leave what behind, dear? The woman hesitated, then exhaled a resigned breath. There was an incident years ago, something involving a man from London. It was, of course, kept under wraps. Richard insisted on it. Miss Marple's lips pressed together in thought. Blackmail had Estelle's so-called premonition been nothing more than the slow realization that someone had discovered her secret, that someone was using it against her. Had she been paying for her silence until she refused? Miss Marple had seen it before. The past did not remain buried. It had a way of digging itself out at the worst possible moment, and sometimes people would kill to keep it in the ground. Miss Marple had spent the morning inspecting the grand staircase of Carrington House, moving with the quiet, The patience of someone who anticipated the discovery ahead. The aged house creaked beneath her feet, yet an unsettling feeling lingered. She delved into her handbag, retrieving a handkerchief, and meticulously glided it along one of the central steps. A faint greasy sheen adhered to the fabric, subtle, yet undeniable. She lifted it to the light oil, too refined to notice, too slick to feel beneath her feet, but just sufficient to send an unsuspecting woman plummeting to her demise. No mere accident, a calculated, intentional act. And then there was the banister. A housemaid had noted that it had been polished just that morning, yet there were no fingerprints, no last desperate grasp, because Estelle had not had a chance to catch herself. Miss Marple exhaled. It was staged. Not only had the murderer known Estelle would use the stairs that night, but they had ensured she would not survive the descent, and they had done so with calculated precision. Rumors in a village were much like ivy on an old stone wall. They clung, spread, and refused to let go. By mid-morning, a fresh whisper had begun to circulate. Someone had spotted a figure near Carrington House on the night of Estelle's death, an individual who should not have been there. This revelation came from Mr. Pritchard, the elderly groundskeeper at the vicarage. He confessed he had remained silent until now, not out of foolishness, but wisdom, understanding that some truths are better left unspoken. However, after a restless night and a troubled conscience, he sought out Miss Marple. "I saw someone near the house that night," he said, his voice rough with age yet firm with certainty, "near the side." The entrance facing the orchard caught Miss Marple's attention as she paused her knitting. "Who was it?" she inquired, looking at Mr. Pritchard. "The trouble, ma'am," he muttered, "was someone who claimed to be elsewhere." It was a direct contradiction, a clear indication that someone had lied. Miss Marple pressed gently for more details. The height, the movement, the hesitation before they slipped into the shadows. Mr. Pritchard hadn't seen a face, but he was certain of one thing: they moved with purpose. Whoever they were, their arrival at the house was no accident. They had come for a reason, and that reason Miss Marple suspected was murder. She had long known that the guilty always reveal themselves if given the right nudge. It was not enough to suspect. The truth had to be drawn out, forced into the light. So, she set about laying a trap. She did not use confrontation, as that would only lead to denials and excuses. Instead, she chose something far more effective: human nature itself. A casual remark here, a knowing glance there, a stray comment placed just so, suggesting that a witness had seen more than they let on. By midday, the village hummed with whispers and conjectures, as shadows loomed near the house at the pivotal moment. Miss Marple observed each suspect with keen eyes, noting those who averted her gaze, those who appeared restless to escape the village, and those who faltered with careless words. She remained patient, allowing the tension to build, and just as anticipated, the truth began to emerge. It was merely a question of time. Chapter 6: The Confrontation. The Carrington residents experienced an unprecedented stillness, heavy and suffocating. Heavy drapes softened the light, and the atmosphere within was dense, not with warmth, but with an unspoken tension. Miss Marple occupied a high-backed chair, her hands delicately placed in her lap, her gaze meticulously scanning the gathered suspects. Richard Carrington, his expression inscrutable, sat with arms crossed, fingers tapping idly against the fabric of his sleeve. Leland Drake, pale and restless, shifted in her seat, her eyes darting toward the door as if contemplating an escape. Dr. Henry Graves, typically so, composed now, he appeared uncharacteristically tense, his jaw tightening each time Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him. Matthew Lawson, the quiet bookseller, sat apart from the others, his fingers worrying the edge of his cuff. He had spoken little, but his eyes moved too much, darting from face to face. Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. "I appreciate you all coming," she said, her voice pleasant, almost conversational. "You see, there are still a few matters that trouble me." No one spoke. The room seemed to contract slightly. "I have always believed," continued, "that individuals often express more through their silence than their spoken words, and I must admit there has been an overwhelming amount of silence surrounding Estelle's death." Leland exhaled sharply, while Richard shifted, and a clock ticked somewhere in the house, marking the slow passage of time. Miss Marple smiled, though there was nothing warm about it. "Shall we begin?" Miss Marple allowed the silence to linger before she spoke again. "I keep returning to Estelle's final words," she said. "A curious thing, really, the staircase is too silent." She let the phrase hang in the air. The air around us felt peculiar at first. A house of such age, and wooden staircases are known to creak, are they not? Lillian offered a subtle nod, affirming the point. Indeed, Miss Marple clasped her hands together, and yet Estelle observed an oddity. She anticipated the familiar sound of creaking stairs, but none came. A brief pause, a flicker of something in Richard's gaze, the slightest tightening of Dr. Graves' lips. "These details reveal much," Miss Marple continued. Firstly, she was not alone in that moment. She sensed something, or rather, the absence of something. It disturbed her enough to comment, and then she looked at Richard. Someone had altered the stairs beforehand. A tension swept through the room. Miss Marple tilted her head, polished, perhaps waxed, or something entirely different. Matthew Lawson exhaled shakily, muttering about oil it would make them smooth, too smooth. Miss Marple's eye sharpened. "Yes, it would," she said, leaning back slightly to let the weight of her words linger. "So you see," she continued, her voice light yet firm, "Estelle's death was not fate, not a prophecy fulfilled. It was something far more intentional lingered in the air, and across from her, someone held their breath for just a fraction too long. The atmosphere was heavy with discomfort, each individual poised for Miss Mel's next utterance. She reached into her handbag, retrieving a small, dark scrap of fabric, which she laid gently on the table before her. "This," she stated, her voice steady yet assertive, "was found clutched in Estelle's hand." A wave of tension swept through the gathered suspects. Silence enveloped them, but their eyes conveyed a multitude of unspoken thoughts. Miss Mel continued, her fingers delicately tracing the torn edges. Edges that do not align with her gown can only signify one thing. They belong to another. Someone who was close enough for Estelle to seize at the final moment. She allowed her gaze to wander slowly around the room, searching for the slightest flicker of recognition, the involuntary response. Then, with intention, she turned to Richard Carrington. His expression stayed meticulously neutral, yet Miss Marple had already observed the absent piece from the cuff of his dressing robe. "Shall we compare them?" she proposed lightly. For a prolonged moment, no one stirred. Then Richard exhaled sharply, pushing back his chair. "This is absurd. You're making wild assumptions based on nothing more than an old woman's paranoia." Miss Mel tilted her head. "Oh, but you see, Mr. Carrington, it isn't paranoia when it turns out to be true." Richard's hand twitched at his side, a fraction of hesitation, a moment too long, and Miss Marple knew he had been with Estelle that night. Miss Marple let the silence linger before speaking again. "This was never about fate," she said, her voice crisp yet measured. "Estelle Carrington's death unfolded as a tragedy, meticulously crafted to resemble a prophecy realized." Richard scoffed, yet a flicker of unease danced in his gaze. Miss Marple pressed on, revealing that Mr. Carrington was aware Estelle had deluded herself into believing her demise was imminent. It was not challenging to exploit that belief, to arrange the scene, so to speak. She turned to the others, stating that the staircase had been tampered with, the doors secured. The very instinct that should have safeguarded her own awareness of danger became the very trap you devised, Lillian. She let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "But why? Why go to such lengths?" Miss Mel's expression softened slightly at the realization. AE had changed her will, prompting a small sound of shock from Matthew Lawson and a nervous swallow from Dr. Graves. Miss Marple nodded, acknowledging the alteration. "She changed the terms, didn't she, Mr. Carrington? You couldn't afford to let that stand." Richard remained rigid, his jaw tight, but his silence spoke volumes, revealing a truth more profound than words. The prophecy had never been real. The only certainty surrounding Estelle's death was the man who had orchestrated it. Richard Carrington sprang from his chair, the abrupt motion catching Lillian off guard as she gasped. Dr. Graves instinctively retreated, but Miss Marple remained unperturbed. "I won't sit here and listen to this nonsense," Richard snapped, his voice taut with barely suppressed panic. "You're all fools." Estelle was unstable. His foot shifted, breath hitching. Miss Marple merely folded her hands. "You were careful," she mused, "but not careful enough." Richard's lips parted, and for a fleeting moment, his facade faltered. "You have no proof," he hissed. "You have nothing." Miss Marple sighed, almost as if disappointed. "Ah, but we do. Your own words just now, Mr. Carrington. You never denied being there that night. Only that we could prove it." A flicker of realization crossed his face. He had said too much. The moment stretched thin as wire. Then, before anyone could react, Richard bolted for the door, but he was not quick enough. A firm hand, Dr. Graves, despite his earlier apprehension, caught his arm, halting him mid-step. Richard struggled, but the fight had already left him, with Miss Marple watching. Quietly offered only a small shake of her head. "There is no escape from the truth, Mr. Carrington," and indeed there wasn't. Chapter 7. The Final Twist. Richard Carrington stopped struggling. His breath was uneven, his hands clenched at his sides. The weight of Miss Marple's words had settled over him like a shroud. Then at last he spoke. "Fine," he muttered, his voice low. "Yes, I was there that night. I went to see Estelle. We argued." A flicker of hesitation. Then, as if forcing himself to believe his own words, he continued. "She." There was an unsettling air as she spoke of fate and glimpsed her own demise. It seemed she had lost her balance. Miss Marple tilted her head, the fabric in her grasp, while his jaw clenched. Perhaps, in a moment of panic, she reached out to me in ambiguous response, deliberately vague. Miss Mel's knitting needles lay still in her lap, her silence heavy as she waited. Richard's shoulders drooped as he murmured, "I didn't mean for it to happen," acknowledging her fragility. Lillian gasped softly, and Dr. Graves averted his gaze, sensing that something was amiss. Miss Marple had heard it all. Confessions emerged, some desperate and trembling, while others were calculated, cold admissions of guilt. Yet this was different. His words felt rehearsed, as if he were reciting a script rather than unveiling the truth. Miss Marple's fingers curled gently over her knitting. No, she thought, this was not the end, not yet. Someone else had been orchestrating events from the shadows all along. Miss Marple exhaled softly, her gaze fixed on Richard Carrington. "No," she said at last, her voice steady and resolute. "That won't do at all." Richard's gaze snapped up. "What, you didn't kill her?" Miss Marple stated matter-of-factly. "You were there, yes. You argued, yes. But Estelle was already a dead woman walking long before you set foot in that house." A heavy silence enveloped the room as Miss Marple's eyes drifted past Richard, landing on Lillian Drake. Lillian sat with her hands neatly folded in her lap, her eyes wide, almost too wide, and she remained silent, too silent. "You were the one who encouraged Estelle's fears, weren't you?" Miss Marple continued, her voice soft yet probing, as if whispering about the inevitability of fate. The conviction that she would meet her end, and when she altered her will, that must have been a significant letdown. Lillian's lips parted in disbelief. "That's absurd. I was her friend." Miss Marple offered a slight nod. "Indeed, and who better to confide in than a trusted friend?" Lan's breath caught in her throat. "You were the one who made the stairs treacherous, weren't you? The one who sowed the seeds of an unavoidable demise, so that when it finally arrived, no one would suspect a thing." Richard turned to Lillian, confusion etched on his face. "Lillian." Miss Marple simply continued her narrative. With a steady voice, she remarked gently that there was no need for force. It was enough to guide her toward her own fate. At that moment, Lillian Drake exchanged glances, while Miss Marple remained composed, her hands resting neatly in her lap. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and neither Lily nor Drake dared to break the silence. Lily's complexion was ashen, her breaths came in quick bursts. Yet Miss Marple took her time, allowing her words to linger in the air before she spoke again. It was a rather clever scheme, she finally noted, acknowledging Lillian's deep understanding of Estelle and the extent of her knowledge about her. She dreaded what she thought was unavoidable, and so you executed the plan that all cunning perpetrators master. You led your target to their own demise willingly. A soft gasp escaped Lillian as her hands tightened in her lap. You amplified her fears, nurtured them, and when the moment arrived, you didn't force her. You merely ensured that there was no retreat as she approached her destiny. Miss Marple turned her gaze to Richard Carrington. "You see, Richard, your burden lies not in the act itself, but in your silence. You had your suspicions, didn't you? Yet it was far easier to let things unfold." Unfolding, Richard's jaw tightened. A man who had been complicit, but not the mastermind. Miss Marple turned back to Lillian. The torn fabric, the deliberate silence of the stairs, the oiled steps, and of course, the final piece, the revised will. You had everything to gain and nothing to lose. Lillian exhaled sharply, a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh. Miss Marple gave a small nod. The puzzle was complete, and the picture it painted was damning. Lillian was taken away, her protests growing fainter as she disappeared down the corridor. Richard Carrington stood still, his gaze fixed on the floor. He hadn't attempted to intervene. He hadn't tried to save her, perhaps because he too had sensed the inevitable. Dr. Graves shook his head, acknowledging the grim truth. She truly believed she was destined for this end. Miss Marple offered a faint smile, devoid of any joy. That was the brilliance of the crime. You see, she had been condemned long before she ever ascended those stairs. Her fate was sealed without Leland needing to lift a finger. All she had to do was ensure that Estelle walked willingly toward her doom. Questioning a crime of manipulation rather than brute force, Miss Marple sighed. Justice has been served, but something troubles her. Dr. Graves frowned, inquiring about her concern. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window. If Estelle had not believed in her own death, would she still be alive? The thought lingered. Had she been murdered, or had she been led to fulfill her own prophecy? Miss Marple could not say for certain, and perhaps that was the true mystery. Malingo faded into the distance as Miss Marple sat in the carriage. With her knitting resting in her lap, she reflected on the many murders she had unraveled over the years. Yet, this particular case lingered in her mind. It wasn't the deception or the cruelty that haunted her. She had encountered far worse. Instead, it was the unresolved question that gnawed at her. Had Estelle foreseen her own demise, or had she been led to accept the inevitable? Was the crime meticulously planned, or had some inexplicable element evaded the bounds of reason? The village faded behind the rolling hills, the air cool and the afternoon still, as Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. Some mysteries, she supposed, were never meant to be solved, and perhaps, just perhaps, that was the most unsettling thought of all.